A very good evening and welcome to another episode of South Africa Today and Beyond. As usual, I'm your host, Kwarakekana. And today in studio, we're having a very interesting conversation. I'm joined by Sari Bashi from Human Rights Watch. And I'm sure a lot of you have been following the discussion around FIFA. And I think the campaign that's already been in existence to call for the Israeli Football Association to be expelled from FIFA. But of course, the campaign has taken a sort of a different turn. And we have Sari today in the studio to take us through that conversation. Welcome to the show, Sari.
Thank you for having me.
Sari, let's talk about last year's FIFA Congress. We saw, there was a lot of disappointment on social media about those who are supporting the Palestinian cause, of course, with the motion that didn't quite happen. People waiting for the Palestinian Football Association to raise the motion to call for Israeli Football Association to be expelled from FIFA. But just take us through what happened since then and to where we are today.
Sure. So in the May 2015 FIFA Congress, which is an annual Congress bringing together about 200 different nations in the form of their football associations, the Palestinian Football Association was supposed to initiate a vote on whether or not to expel the Israel Football Association. At the last minute, the Palestinian Football Association withdrew the motion, and rather than hold the vote, the decision was to create a monitoring committee that would be headed by South Africa's own Tokyo Sakwali, a FIFA official, and the committee was tasked with resolving three issues that were in dispute between the Palestinian and Israeli associations. The first was racism in Israeli football. The second was restrictions on freedom of movement for Palestinian players and also equipment into and out of the West Bank. And the last issue was the fate of clubs that play in the Israeli Football Association, but they're playing in settlements in the occupied West Bank.
Let's talk about, you're raising three issues. And for me, the one is also quite interesting, the restrictions of movement of football players, officials, and of course, this also extend to spectators as well. And if you look at the Rio Olympics, we saw again on social media about how some of the Palestinian athletes that are meant to participate in the Rio Olympics actually had to leave a bit earlier and camp out in certain countries because of those challenges, the restriction of movement of athletes. But let's talk about the issue of settlements. Maybe just take us into confidence and let's take the audience as well. What does the settlement industry really mean, but also in the context of international law, but specifically for this particular case?
Sure, and it's a good idea to try to understand it because when you understand what a settlement is, you can understand why it's so problematic for these clubs to be playing in settlements. So in 1967, Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza, and it established civilian settlements in those areas. So basically, it moved its own civilians into land that was taken from Palestinian villages, in some cases from Palestinian individuals, and created communities in the West Bank that are Israeli only. So these are places where land would be walled off by fences usually. Israelis are allowed to enter, but Palestinians cannot enter the settlements except as laborers who have work permits to work there. There's now more than 500,000 Israeli settlers living in the occupied West Bank. And the problem is that these settlements are a trigger for serious human rights abuses. So first of all, in order to protect the settlements, the Israeli military imposes pretty severe restrictions on Palestinian freedom of movement. Checkpoints, roads that are closed, a lack of access in the name of protecting these civilian communities. Second of all, there's a discriminatory regime that Israel operates in the West Bank, where it invests in and subsidizes Israeli businesses inside the settlements, but disallows Palestinian businesses to get, for example, licenses or to build. The 60% of the West Bank that Israel administers directly, where the settlements are, Palestinians can't build. The rejection rate for building permits is 94%, meaning almost nobody can build. And then when people build without permits, those structures, those homes are destroyed. This is all in the name of promoting the settlements. The settlements also use natural resources that under international law belong to Palestinians. For example, extracting stone from the ground, water, other resources that the occupying power cannot take from the occupied territory. And the law under occupation is that an occupying power can take land in an occupied territory, but only for its own military purposes or for the benefit of the local population. So there's no authority whatsoever to economically exploit an occupied territory for the benefit of your own civilians.
So in essence, what you're saying is that the settlement industry in itself is quite problematic. The institution of the settlement itself is very problematic. But you're raising the issues around the responsibility of the occupying power, and in this case, which is Israel. I mean, the occupation is, 50 years now in 2016. And let's talk about some of the responsibilities of Israel as an occupying power, particularly in this case. When you're talking about the movement of officials, the movement of spectators, the movement of football players, what then becomes the obligation of Israel as an occupying power in this particular context?
Sure. As an occupying power, there are restrictions that Israel can impose for security purposes, but other than those restrictions, it has an obligation to facilitate normal civilian life. So that would mean, for example, allowing the Palestinian football industry to flourish, because that's part of normal civilian life. Some of the restrictions that Israel has been imposing on travel, especially between Gaza and the West Bank or abroad, are not for security reasons. They're part of sweeping categorical restrictions that don't let people move or travel. Gaza, for example, is practically closed. And so one of the triggers for this vote in FIFA was the fact that Palestinian players couldn't play. You have one Palestinian association, but you can't travel from Gaza to the West Bank for a match or for a competition. And also you couldn't get equipment in because of those restrictions. So once the monitoring committee was established, there's been some improvement. Israel is now allowing more freedom of movement. There are still issues, but that's that's a bit of an easier problem to fix, because it's something where Israel can make a change without it being politically problematic inside Israel. The settlement clubs are a harder issue, because in the case of the settlement clubs, what we and others are saying is that you can't fix this. These people are not allowed to play in the settlements, and by playing in the settlements, they're actually contributing to serious human rights abuses.
Now, let's talk about, I mean, in this particular case, we're talking about the settlements and the campaign that's now sort of is gaining some popularity. What is the role, what has been the role of Human Rights Watch in this particular campaign thus far?
So the monitoring committee had been working for a year. In the last Congress in May, its mandate was extended, but people are starting to ask questions. What about the settlement clubs? Because that was a real sticking point. Human Rights Watch published a report last month doing some research on what those clubs are. And what we tried to do was connect the dots between what might seem like an innocent activity, playing football, including children and youth playing football, and serious human rights abuses. So, for example, the fields in which the settlement clubs play, these are in settlements in the occupied West Bank. All of those fields were established on land that was unlawfully taken from Palestinians. In the case of the settlement of Givat Ze'ev, the field is located on land that belongs to a Palestinian family in the Palestinian town of Betunia, near Ramallah. For the last 30 years, that family has been unable to access their land because when Israel built the settlement, it declared it off limits to Palestinians. They were offered no compensation. They can't farm on their land. And FIFA, which is sponsoring these matches through its affiliate, the Israel Football Association, didn't offer them compensation. This family doesn't give permission for FIFA to hold matches on its land. And so we're saying that's one of the abuses that is inherent to holding matches in the settlements. Another problem is discrimination. So these fields where the clubs play, they're open to Israelis but not Palestinians. Some of them have football camps, for example. So they're being held in the occupied West Bank, but Palestinian residents of the West Bank can't come. They can't watch the games, they can't play in the games, they can't send their kids to these football training camps because settlements by military order are off limits to Palestinians. And this is something that you can't fix it. These, as well-meaning as some of these clubs may be, they can't give the land back. They can't change the military order that bars Palestinians from entering the settlements. The only thing they can do is move their games inside Israel.
Now let's talk about where FIFA finds itself in the context of international law and possibly being complicit in the violation of international law when we're looking at the settlement industry and how the settlements itself and some of the activities that you're talking about are in violations of international law. What is FIFA possibly immersing itself into when we look at the situation?
So Human Rights Watch has been working with FIFA for a number of years about its what you could call corporate social responsibility or human rights responsibilities. And FIFA has gotten a lot of criticism, for example, for stadiums built in Qatar where foreign workers were dying under terrible conditions. And as a result of that experience, FIFA has recently committed to do better on human rights. There's a set of principles called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which outlines the human rights responsibilities that businesses owe. And basically it means businesses have an obligation to make sure their activities do not contribute to or benefit from serious violations of human rights or international humanitarian law, the law of occupation. And so in the case of these settlement clubs, we would argue that by holding games on land that has been stolen from others under conditions of discrimination, FIFA is contributing to serious human rights violations. And because there's nothing FIFA can do to fix it, you can't fix the settlements, you can only remove them. We're saying that FIFA has to stop allowing its affiliate, the Israel Football Association, from holding games in these territories. And hopefully, the happy thing is that FIFA has recently recommitted to its human rights responsibilities. In April, it received a report, a set of recommendations from the author of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And in that report, FIFA agreed to implement its human rights responsibilities throughout all of its activities. So what we're asking to do in our advocacy now is for FIFA to basically do what it promised and make sure that its activities don't contribute to these serious abuses.
And are we seeing institutions, I mean, you talk about FIFA, you really talk about going after one of the biggest institutions, I think, globally as well. And of course, I mean, you talk about the complicity of FIFA having corporate social responsibility. And this would extend also to, I think, companies generally that are found involved in the settlement industry in whatever way. And I think you've quite pointed that out. What has been FIFA's response? And I think generally on the issues of abiding by the UN guidelines that you're talking about, what has FIFA's response been?
I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed so far because we wrote a report. We requested response from FIFA, from the Israel Football Association, from the clubs themselves whose home fields are in the settlements. Everybody responded except for FIFA. And FIFA said that they're looking at the issue. We're also a bit concerned because in May, the president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, indicated that the issue would be decided at a meeting this week, actually, on October 13th in Zurich, where the FIFA Council would consider what to do about the settlement clubs. And we've recently seen that he's backtracking a bit. And he's saying we need to slow down the process. It's too early to decide this issue. So we're hoping that FIFA will do the right thing. And I also want to emphasize that, national associations, they have agency here because FIFA is a membership-based organization. And there's been criticism of FIFA in the past that things are done in backdoor dealings and without transparency. We think this is the time for activists to ask their own member associations for accountability within FIFA.
Let's go for a quick ad break, Sari. I want us to talk about FIFA's rules as it pertains to this particular question when we come back. Let's go for a quick ad break and we'll take the conversation forward after this. Welcome back, and before the ad break, we were talking to Sari Pashi, and she's still with us in studio today. We're talking about the sort of controversial discussion around the FIFA and Israeli situation and the 6 settlement teams that are found playing as part of the Israeli Football League. And Palestine solidarity activists are saying expel the 6 Israeli settlement teams. Sari, let's continue the conversation and let's talk about FIFA's rules. What do FIFA's rules state around this particular issue of the territorial issue and the settlement issue?
Yeah, one thing that's surprising about this issue is that these clubs have played for as long as they do. Because in other situations of occupation, when an occupying power tried to field teams from the occupied territory in its national association, FIFA kicked them out. Most recently in Russia and Crimea, Russia tried to field teams from Crimea and the Russian League, and the European Association of FIFA, UEFA, kicked them out. It's been the case in other places, Nagorno-Karabakh, Northern Cyprus. FIFA's rules state that one member association shall not play on the territory of another member association without permission. And the Palestinian Football Association is understood to cover the geographical area of Gaza and the West Bank. So it would seem pretty clear that the Israel Football Association doesn't have authority to hold games on the territory of the Palestinian Football Association. I think that's part of the reason why this monitoring committee was established, to try to resolve the issue also in accordance with FIFA rules.
Sure. I mean, earlier on before the ad break, we're talking about the urgency that national associations also have. Are we seeing any sort of response? And what is the attitude of some of the national associations, if you are familiar? What are they saying in terms of this particular issue? And the campaign is gaining quite a lot of traction. And I don't think FIFA wants to find itself in a scandalous position. I mean, last year we saw a lot of scandal coming out of the institution, issues of bribery, and I mean, there were a lot of issues. It was a scandalous situation, a scandalous time for FIFA. And this is not a particularly tasteful situation that FIFA wants to find itself in. So what has been the response of national associations that are part of FIFA?
So I think the response among people has been great. There's a petition with almost 200,000 signatures asking Tokyo Sakwali, the chair of the monitoring committee, to recommend that the settlement clubs be excluded. There's been some very good work from activist groups to try to demand justice in this case. We have a concern that FIFA is still operating through non-transparent procedures. And that's why I think it's so important that people make it clear that they want to see a just solution. They want to see a rules-based solution, and they don't want FIFA to be holding games on stolen land.
Sure, I think that's quite clear. But now let's talk about the monitoring committee. Who is on this monitoring committee besides Tokyo Sakwali? And what is the attitude that we're sort of seeing, or the potential outcome of the monitoring committee leading into the FIFA Council this coming week?
So Tokyo Sakwali has said that he has created recommendations, and those recommendations will be brought to the monitoring committee for a decision in this week. The Israel Football Association has written a letter saying it doesn't want those recommendations to be voted on, and it actually refused to allow the monitoring committee to convene, because the monitoring committee is chaired by Mr. Sakwali, but it includes representatives of the Israel and Palestinian football associations and their allies. So it looks like the monitoring committee is not going to convene before the council. The bigger question is whether Mr. Sakwali is going to insist that his recommendations be brought to a vote, because there's been pushback from inside FIFA to delay, and we're concerned that it's a return to these non-transparent backdoor dealings. We think Mr. Sakwali, especially with South Africa's history, should continue to take a very strong stance. We haven't seen his recommendations, but we hope that they would say that FIFA should act within the confines of the law and not allow these games to be held in the settlements.
I mean, there are those some in certain quarters that would argue that, the establishment of the committee itself is a way to try push back the issue. So the establishment of the committee itself is a subtle suggestion to say, no, let's take the issue a bit back. And I think that and some are saying, let's be more decisive. Let's just call for a motion. What are your thoughts on this issue?
I mean, look, I think that there's a chance for this to come out the right way, because the monitoring committee has the authority to submit these recommendations, and they should be voted on, first by the council and perhaps also by the Congress. I would be concerned about continued delay. So if this issue is not brought for a vote at the FIFA Council meeting this week, it would be a source of concern, because it seems like a pretty clear-cut issue. These are games that shouldn't be held there, and I would say that I do think that the bigger the group making this decision, the better it is, because if this, for example, comes before the Congress, then FIFA's 200+ member states will have a chance to weigh in, and international consensus is against the settlements. Most countries do not recognize Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank. They say you can't treat it as if it were part of Israel. It's not.
So let's have a situation where the settlement teams are expelled from the Israeli Football League. What would that mean? I think for FIFA specifically, but I think generally in the Israeli-Palestine situation, what would that really signal? And also in the context of international law, what would that really mean?
It would be hugely important, because part of the problem with the occupation has been a lack of accountability for very serious human rights violations. Nobody is interfering with the settlements. If FIFA were to draw a clear line and say this is not legitimate, it would have reverberating effects throughout the world, because there are worldwide efforts to try to prevent Israel from exploiting the West Bank for its own economic and civilian purposes. And similarly, I think for FIFA, it would be a wonderful statement that FIFA is turning over a new leaf, and FIFA wants to act in accordance with its human rights responsibilities, hopefully not just in the West Bank, but also in Qatar and in other places where there have been human rights abuses.
I mean, you talk about the worldwide response, and let's talk about some of the campaigns that are going around globally around this particular issue. What kind of sort of organizing are we seeing coming from different parts of the world? And I think sports is quite an interesting sector, because, for example, the Rio Olympics, we're indicative of a particular current that's happening globally, and around how sports basically is used as a tool to say, we are saying no to racism, we're saying no to human rights violations, where certain athletes were saying we're not willing to play with Israeli athletes because we recognize them as ambassadors of a particular state that practice certain policies that we don't agree with, in violations of international law, violations of also Palestinian human rights as well within the sporting community. Now, what sort of campaigns are we seeing? Either coordinated campaigns, also, but just maybe I think human rights activists generally around the world. What kind of response are we seeing on the ground around this campaign and sports generally?
People care deeply about football. It's one of the most important things. And so we have seen people writing letters. There's been an initiative by members of the European Parliament to call on President Infantino not to allow these clubs to play. There have been people writing op-eds, giving interviews to the press. It's helpful. I think we should remember that it's not only sports, it's also business. FIFA does an annual business that's worth $33 billion per year. That's a lot of money. And that money, in this case, is being used to fuel human rights abuses. And so from our point of view, it's important that people as sports fans, also as consumers of the football industry, make sure their own money is not being used to perpetuate abuses. And if we can do it in this case, we have a chance of doing it in some of the other cases where FIFA activities are complicit in human rights abuses.
And Zari, I mean, you know, when you talk about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, people emotions get quite high, especially within the Palestine Solidarity Committee. Those are quite committed and advocates of Palestine Solidarity movement, but also within the Israeli quarters as well. What has been some of the response from those quarters around this campaign?
So the current Israeli government has made one of its central policies erasing the line between the settlements and Israel. So any kind of exclusion of these teams would be completely anathema to the Israeli government. And that's why they have been applying very, very, very strong pressure within FIFA not to allow there to be a change in policy. I think that that's exactly why it's so important. Because, you know, from my point of view as a human rights activist, this is an opportunity for the international community to draw a distinction between what's legitimate, people playing football, that's great, and what is illegitimate, which is dispossessing people, taking their land, imposing restrictions on freedom of movement. The injustice that is the settlement industry, the injustice that cannot be corrected except by pulling out of the settlements. And we're asking not just FIFA to pull out of the settlements, but all businesses to pull out of the settlements, because that would dry them up. The settlements are not just created by politicians. They're supported by private businesses all over the world. And you or I might not even know that when we buy a product, we're actually investing in the settlements. That's why it's so important for there to be labeling so that consumers can decide, transparency about where money is going, and really good activism around corporations so that they will stop promoting these abuses.
You're raising a particularly important point to say that we might not know. But I think in the case of FIFA, national associations that are affiliated to FIFA also are indirectly then complicit in the settlement industry. Would that be correct to say?
FIFA is a member-based organization. So if FIFA is violating human rights abuses, the member associations are responsible and they should take action. And I'd like to see more, especially from Africa, because, you know, Cameroon, Tunisia, there's a couple of key countries inside Africa, South Africa as well, where we think if member associations would make it clear to FIFA that they don't want this to continue, it could be important, especially in advance of the council meeting, but more generally to make it clear that they want a principled approach to this issue.
See, in essence, national football associations and member associations to FIFA should essentially be saying you can't be complicit in human rights violations in our name because they form part of FIFA.
Sure, and it's not just the member associations. Member associations are funded by taxpayer money. So it's the international community. It's people like you and me.
So it's us,
yes,
in essence.
It's us. It's all of us.
Sorry, thank you so much for joining us on the show. But quickly before we go, how can people get involved in this?
So there's a wonderful petition by Avaz called Give Israeli Settlement Clubs a Red Card. You can Google it and sign that petition, write op-eds, and the most important, write to your national football associations and ask them how they're going to vote on this issue.
All right. So there you have it, people. Give the Israeli settlements a red card. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And of course, thank you so much to my guest today in the studio, Sari Pashi from Human Rights Watch. Join us again next week for another episode of South Africa Today and Beyond. Good evening.